Earl Whitfield was 51 years old when he did the thing that made half the county think he'd lost his mind. It was the spring of 1982, and the pasture behind his barn, 18 acres of decent bluestem grass his daddy had grazed cattle on for 30 years, sat empty. Earl had sold off the last of his herd the autumn before, tired of chasing beef prices that never seemed to catch up with what it cost to raise the animals. He stood at the fence line one cold morning with a thermos of coffee and a look on his face his wife, Ruth, said she hadn't seen since he came home from Korea. "I'm putting in pines," he told her. Ruth set down the dish towel. "Pines don't feed anybody, Earl." "No," he said, "but they'll be here in 30 years. Corn won't. Cattle won't. I'll be dead most likely, but the pines will be here." The neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. In a county where every man's business was everyone's business, you didn't turn 18 acres of grazing land into a tree farm without people talking. Word passed from the feed store to the church parking lot to the auction barn faster than any of them could have planted a fence post, and by the time the seedlings had taken root, most everybody within 10 miles knew Earl Whitfield had done something they considered peculiar. Some of it was simple curiosity. Farmers drove by slower than usual on the county road that ran along Earl's east line, necks craned toward the pasture like they expected to see something had changed overnight. Most of it, though, was the particular brand of skepticism that farming country reserves for anybody who breaks from what's always been done. Land was for grazing or land was for row crops, and a man who put his acreage into something that wouldn't pay him a dime for a decade or more was, in the eyes of his neighbors, either a fool or a man who didn't need the money, and everybody in the county knew Earl Whitfield needed the money same as the rest of them. Hollis Petrie, who ran 200 head on the section next door, leaned on Earl's fence one afternoon and shook his head like he was looking at a car wreck. "You planted trees in a pasture," he said, like maybe Earl hadn't noticed. "I did." "Pines don't do nothing for 6, 8 years but sit there looking scrawny. And then what? You gonna log your own backyard? Bring a skidder through here and tear the place up for a truckload of pulpwood? Something like that." Hollis laughed, and it wasn't a mean laugh exactly, just the kind of laugh a man gives when he's certain of something. "Earl, you could have leased this ground to me for grazing and made more money doing nothing than you'll ever see out of a pine tree." That was the start of it. Not cruelty, not really, just the steady, needling doubt of men who'd farmed the same ground the same way their whole lives and couldn't see the sense in doing different. At the feed store, at church, at the auction barn on Saturdays, somebody always had something to say about Earl's trees. They called it back pasture, Earl's Folly. One year, at the county fair, somebody pinned a little hand-lettered sign to the 4-H board as a joke. "Best crop of nothing, E. Whitfield, first place." Earl heard about all of it. He never said much back. He kept mowing the fire lanes between the rows, kept an eye out for pine beetle, kept walking the pasture some evenings just to watch the seedlings inch upward, a few inches some years, more in the wet ones. Ruth used to bring him a glass of tea and stand with him at the fence, and neither of them said much either. By 1985 the trees were taller than a man. By 1987 they closed canopy in patches, dark green and thick, and the pasture didn't look like a pasture anymore. It looked like the edge of a forest, which is what it was becoming. The laughing had mostly quieted down by then, not because anybody admitted Earl was right, but because 6 years is a long time to keep telling the same joke. Then came the summer of 1988. Nobody in that part of the country had seen a drought like it, not since the 30s, and the old-timers who remembered the 30s said this one came close to matching it. The rain simply stopped. It stopped in April, and it did not meaningfully come back until September. By June the creeks that never went dry went dry. By July the pastures, real pastures, grass pastures, the kind Hollis Petrie and half the county were still running cattle on, had burned down to brown dirt and stubble. Hay that should have been chest high stood 8 inches in yellow. Corn tasseled out at 4 feet instead of 8, if it tasseled at all. Stock ponds cracked at the edges like old plates. Cattlemen started selling down their herds in July because there was nothing to feed them, and no money to buy feed with, since feed corn itself was scorched in the same fields as everything else. Hollis Petrie sold 60 head at a loss that summer, cattle he'd meant to carry through to fall. He wasn't alone. The sale barn ran cattle through every week that summer, more animals than it had handled in years, all of it distress selling, all of it men trying to get something for stock they could no longer feed or water. Earl's 18 acres, meanwhile, stood green. Not lush. Nothing was lush in the summer of 1988, but green, and standing, and alive. The pines had put down roots deep enough by then to reach moisture the surface grass never could. Their canopy held shade over ground that stayed cooler and damper than the open pasture beside it. The rows Earl had planted as a windbreak in waiting were doing exactly what a windbreak does, cutting the hot wind that came baking across the flat, dry fields and scorched everything it touched. Earl noticed his own garden, tucked in the lee of the tree line, held on through July in a way Ruth's sister's garden 2 miles off, out in the open, simply did not. More than that, and this was the part that got talked about at the feed store that fall in a very different tone than 1982, timbermen started calling. Pulpwood and pine sawtimber prices were climbing that year, partly on demand that had nothing to do with the drought at all, and partly because so much marginal cropland across the South and lower Midwest had gone into pine over the preceding decade that a real market had built up around it, buyers looking to lock in supply. A forester out of the district office drove out and cruised Earl's stand that September, walked the rows with a clipboard the way Earl once had with a dibble bar, and told him that in another 8 or 10 years, with a first thinning cut now and a final harvest later, that 18 acres could be worth more than most men in the county would clear on 18 acres of row crop in a good year, and worth it again after that, because unlike a corn crop, a pine stand didn't need to be replanted. From bare dirt every spring, at the mercy of whatever the sky decided to do. "Reckon I owe you an apology, Earl," he said finally. "You don't owe me nothing, Hollis. I called it Earl's Folly for 6 years. I heard." Hollis turned his hat over in his hands. "My cattle didn't have a lick of shade this summer. Not one tree on that whole back 40. I always figured trees were just ground you couldn't use." He looked at the pines again. "Didn't figure on ground using itself, I guess. Taking care of things while I wasn't looking." Earl didn't gloat. It wasn't in him, and besides, he understood the impulse that had made men laugh in the first place. Pines didn't feed a family the way cattle or corn did, not for a long while, and asking a man to wait 6 or 8 or 30 years for a payoff went against everything hard times had ever taught a farmer about hedging his bets. Earl hadn't planted the trees to prove anybody wrong. He'd planted them because his daddy always said the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time was today, and Earl had simply decided, at 51, that today would have to do. He kept farming the ground another 11 years before he finally sold the standing timber off half the stand, replanted, and let the other half grow on toward saw log size. Ruth kept the newspaper clipping from '88, the one where the county extension office wrote up his stand, as an example for a soil conservation field day, and pinned it inside a kitchen cabinet where she could see it doing dishes. Earl never did take it down off the wall at the co-op where somebody, without much ceremony, had gone and unpinned that old fair board joke sign and thrown it in the trash. The pines are still there today, most of them, taller than the barn by a wide margin now, standing where a pasture used to be, doing on quiet ground exactly what Earl always said they would, waiting, growing, and proving out a patient man's bet long after everyone else had stopped keeping score.